In the spring of 1856, in the isolated plantation country of southern Georgia, a woman was found dying in her bed, her body wasted to barely 90 pounds despite having weighed nearly 280 pounds just 18 months earlier. Miss Abigail Thornwood, one of the wealthiest plantation owners in Willow County, had stopped eating, stopped leaving her room, and filled 17 leather journals with confessions so disturbing that the local physician who discovered them would seal them away for over a century. But it wasn't Abigail's physical deterioration that horrified Dr. Marcus Wendell when he arrived at Magnolia Ridge. It was what he found in the room adjacent to hers, a freed slave named Samuel, sitting motionless in a chair staring at nothing, surrounded by letters that revealed a deception so elaborate, so psychologically devastating, that it had destroyed two human beings completely. For nearly 9 years, Samuel had executed what may be the most calculated act of revenge ever documented in the antebellum South. He had made Abigail fall in love with him, had given her the one thing her wealth could never buy, genuine affection and understanding, and then systematically revealed that every moment of their relationship had been an elaborate lie designed to destroy her. 37 other enslaved people at Magnolia Ridge had watched this slow-motion tragedy unfold, understanding that Samuel was playing a game whose rules only he knew, whose ending would leave everyone damaged beyond repair. But the journals Dr. Wendell discovered revealed something even more disturbing than Samuel's calculated manipulation. They revealed the reason Samuel couldn't complete his revenge, the terrible truth that transformed this from a simple story of vengeance into something far more complex and heartbreaking. A truth that neither Samuel nor Abigail had known when their relationship began, that would force them both to confront an impossible question. What happens when you discover that the person you've been destroying was as much a victim as you were? The official records were sealed by county authorities and hidden away in a locked vault at the Savannah courthouse. But the truth about Magnolia Ridge reveals a darkness that challenges everything we thought we understood about revenge, justice, and the long-term psychological effects of systematic cruelty. Before we descend into the tragic spiral of Magnolia Ridge, if this story intrigues you, make sure to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into America's darkest historical mysteries. Abigail Thornwood was not what one would expect of a plantation mistress in 1840s Georgia. Unlike the delicate, corseted ladies who graced the parlours of neighbouring estates, Abigail was a woman of substantial physical presence, weighing nearly 280 pounds at her heaviest, with a face that contemporaries described in their private correspondence as unfortunate in its features and lacking the gentle refinement expected of her station. These assessments, preserved in letters between other plantation families, reveal the casual cruelty of a society that valued women primarily for their ornamental qualities and their ability to produce heirs for wealthy families. Her isolation was not merely physical, but profoundly social. At social gatherings, which she attended with decreasing frequency as the years progressed, other plantation wives would cluster together in their silk gowns and whispered conversations, leaving Abigail to sit alone, her presence acknowledged with the bare minimum of courtesy that her wealth and property demanded. Young men who might have overlooked her appearance for the sake of her substantial inheritance inevitably found reasons to court other, more conventionally attractive prospects, leaving Abigail to watch from the sidelines as women with half her intelligence and a fraction of her property became wives and mothers while she remained alone. The Thornwood plantation had come to her through tragedy. Her father, Nathaniel Thornwood, had died in 1845 under circumstances that were officially recorded as a riding accident, though whispers throughout the county suggested something far darker. Several enslaved people who had worked in the main house disappeared around the same time, sold away to distant plantations before any questions could be asked. Abigail, at 28 years old, had inherited the entire estate, its 450 acres of cotton fields, its substantial debts, and its population of 63 enslaved men, women, and children, whose labour sustained the property's operations. What made Abigail unusual among plantation owners was not her gender, though female plantation managers were relatively uncommon, but rather her apparent softness in the management of enslaved labourers. Unlike her father, whose reputation for brutal discipline had been whispered about even in a society that accepted violence against enslaved people as normal and necessary, Abigail seemed determined to operate Magnolia Ridge differently. She abolished the use of the whip for minor infractions, improved the quality of food rations distributed to the quarters, and even permitted enslaved families to maintain small garden plots for their own use, privileges that were far from universal on Georgia plantations of this era. Neighbouring plantation owners viewed these policies with suspicion and contempt. Miss Thornwood's peculiar gentleness will surely lead to disorder and insubordination, wrote James Crawford, owner of the adjacent Willowbrook plantation, in an 1846 letter to his brother in Charleston. A firm hand is what these people understand and require. Her father knew this truth, though it seems the daughter has forgotten the lessons he tried to impart. What Crawford and others failed to understand was that Abigail's management style had nothing to do with humanitarian sentiment and everything to do with a deep, abiding shame that coloured every aspect of her relationship with the people her family had enslaved. Samuel arrived at Magnolia Ridge in the late summer of 1847, purchased at the Savannah slave market for the substantial sum of $1,200, a price that reflected both his youth, he was approximately 25 years old, and his apparent good health and strength. The bill of sale, preserved in the Thornwood family papers, describes him simply as one Negro man, Samuel, sound in body and limb, no known defects or rebellious tendencies. But this dry legal description concealed a man of remarkable intelligence and careful observation, qualities that he had learned to hide behind a mask of deference and simplicity that white society expected from enslaved people. His arrival at the plantation was noted by several of the other enslaved workers with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Elderly Aunt Celia, who had lived at Magnolia Ridge for over 40 years and served as an unofficial leader among the quarter's residents, later recalled in testimony given to investigators that Samuel had eyes that looked right through you, like he was seeing something nobody else could see. Most new folks came in scared or broken down, but this one, he came in watching and thinking, and that made me nervous from the start. Abigail's interest in Samuel began almost immediately, though in ways that seemed innocent enough at first. She assigned him to work in the main house rather than in the fields, an assignment that was not unusual for enslaved people who showed intelligence and aptitude for more complex tasks. He served meals, maintained the grounds immediately surrounding the house, and performed various duties that kept him in close proximity to Abigail throughout the day. What was unusual was the frequency with which Abigail engaged him in conversation, asking his opinions on matters ranging from the weather to the proper care of her rose garden, treating him with a familiarity that made other white observers deeply uncomfortable. Martha Whitmore, wife of a neighbouring planter who occasionally visited Magnolia Ridge, wrote in her diary about a disturbing incident she witnessed in the fall of 1847. I observed Miss Thornwood speaking to one of her house servants, a young Negro man, with an intimacy that quite shocked me. She laughed at something he said, actually laughed as though they were equals engaged in pleasant discourse. When I mentioned to her afterward that such familiarity was unbecoming and potentially dangerous, she looked at me with the strangest expression and said only, "You need not worry yourself about my household management, Martha. I know exactly what I'm doing." This interaction, seemingly minor, revealed something that Martha Whitmore could not have understood. Abigail was not being carelessly familiar with Samuel. She was being deliberately vulnerable, opening herself to him in ways that would prove catastrophic. Over the following months, Samuel's role in the household expanded in ways that raised eyebrows throughout the county. He was given better clothing than other enslaved workers, fed from the same kitchen that prepared Abigail's meals, rather than from the communal pots in the quarters, and assigned a private room in the main house, rather than sleeping in the crowded cabins where other enslaved people lived. To outside observers, these privileges suggested either foolish sentimentality or something darker and more scandalous. But what was actually happening beneath the surface of these apparent privileges was far more calculated than anyone suspected. Every evening, as the sun set over the cotton fields and the other enslaved workers retired to their quarters, Samuel would find Abigail in the library or on the veranda, always appearing to stumble upon her by accident, l'Abbé never seeming to seek her out deliberately. He had recognized something in her from their very first interactions, something that most people either couldn't see or chose to ignore, a desperate loneliness, a hunger for connection and validation that had been denied her throughout her entire life. "Miss Abigail," he would say, his voice carefully modulated to suggest respect, tinged with just the slightest hint of warmth. "I noticed you reading earlier. Might I ask what book has captured your attention?" The question was innocent enough, but it represented the opening move in a psychological chess game that Samuel had been planning since before he even arrived at Magnolia Ridge. Their conversations began simply, discussions of literature and philosophy that allowed Abigail to demonstrate her intelligence to someone who seemed genuinely interested. But Samuel's questions were never random. He asked about her childhood, watching her face carefully as she revealed the loneliness of growing up without a mother, the difficulty of pleasing a father whose standards seemed designed to be impossible to meet. He asked about her dreams for Magnolia Ridge's future, nodding thoughtfully as she described her vision of a plantation that could be profitable without being cruel. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, he began to position himself not as a servant seeking favour, but as a fellow thinking being who found her ideas fascinating and worthy of serious consideration. What made Samuel's manipulation so effective was that he gave Abigail something she had never experienced before, the sensation of being truly seen and valued for who she was rather than what she represented. When other plantation mistresses dismissed her ideas as eccentric or impractical, Samuel listened with apparent fascination. When society matrons excluded her from their social gatherings, Samuel made her feel that their company would have been a waste of her time anyway. When men who might have courted her for her wealth chose prettier, more conventional women instead, Samuel's presence suggested that perhaps conventional attractiveness was less important than she had been taught to believe. But beneath this carefully constructed intimacy, Samuel was compiling detailed psychological profiles in his mind, cataloguing every vulnerability, every fear, every desperate need that Abigail revealed in their conversations. He noted how her voice changed when she mentioned her father, the slight tremor that suggested trauma rather than simple grief. He observed how she deflected compliments but visibly bloomed under genuine intellectual engagement. He recognized that she had convinced herself that her loneliness was a choice, a preference for solitude over shallow social connections, when in reality it was a defense mechanism against the pain of repeated rejection. The journals Abigail kept during this period, discovered after the final tragedy, reveal a woman experiencing something she had never known before and desperately trying to understand it. "Samuel sees me," she wrote in November 1847, the words slightly smudged as though she had been crying while writing them. "Truly sees me in ways that no one else ever has. When we talk, I forget the differences that society insists must define us. I forget that I am ugly and alone. I forget everything except the warmth of being understood." These entries, written in Abigail's careful script, with occasional passages crossed out and rewritten as she struggled to find the right words, document the systematic dismantling of her emotional defences, a process that Samuel orchestrated with remarkable psychological sophistication. By the spring of 1848, less than a year after Samuel's arrival, something had shifted fundamentally in the dynamics of Magnolia Ridge. Abigail no longer gave Samuel direct orders in front of others. Instead, she would frame her instructions as requests, seeking his opinion on how tasks might best be accomplished. She began taking meals in the study rather than the formal dining room, with Samuel serving her and then, increasingly, remaining to discuss the day's events and the books she was reading. Most shockingly to the few white visitors who witnessed these interactions, she had begun to permit Samuel to sit in her presence without standing at attention, treating him more like a companion than a servant. What no one else could see was how carefully Samuel controlled every aspect of this apparent intimacy. He knew exactly when to laugh at her observations, when to gently challenge her ideas to make the intellectual engagement feel authentic, when to reveal carefully selected personal details about himself that would create the illusion of mutual vulnerability. Every gesture of affection, every moment of apparent spontaneity was calculated and rehearsed. He had become what later psychologists would recognize as a perfect manipulator, Someone who could manufacture emotional connection without experiencing any genuine feeling himself. Yet even as Samuel executed his plan with precision, something unexpected was beginning to happen. Something that he would not fully recognize until it was too late to matter. The other enslaved workers at Magnolia Ridge watched these developments with growing alarm, understanding that Samuel had achieved a position of influence that could either improve their circumstances or make them significantly worse. But what they couldn't know, what even Samuel himself didn't fully understand yet, was that this psychological game he was playing would eventually trap him as surely as it trapped Abigail. It was on a humid August night in 1848, during one of their long evening conversations on the veranda of the main house, that Samuel made his move. The cicadas were singing their endless summer song, and the air hung thick and heavy with the scent of magnolia blossoms from the trees that gave the plantation its name. Abigail sat in her favourite chair, a glass of sweetened tea beside her, reading aloud from a volume of poetry she had discovered in her father's library. Samuel stood nearby, ostensibly trimming the lantern wicks, but actually waiting, watching, preparing for the moment he had been building toward for over a year. The moment had been carefully chosen, timed for when Abigail was at her most vulnerable, her most dependent on the emotional connection they had built. He had spent 12 months studying her, understanding her, learning exactly how to break through her final defences. He knew that she had begun to rely on these evening conversations as the highlight of her day, that she had started planning what she would discuss with him, that she sometimes wrote down observations or questions specifically to share with him later. He knew, because he had carefully engineered it, that he had become the centre of her emotional world. "Miss Abigail," he said, his voice carefully calibrated to suggest both hesitation and determination, the sound of a man forcing himself to speak a difficult truth. He set down the lantern he had been holding, his hands trembling slightly in what appeared to be genuine nervousness, but was actually the result of deliberate muscle control. "I need to tell you something that I've been holding inside since the day I arrived here. Something that weighs on me every moment we spend together." Abigail looked up from her book, marking her place with her finger, her expression shifting from peaceful contentment to immediate concern. In that moment, she was completely focused on him, completely open to whatever he might say, completely vulnerable. "What is it, Samuel?" she asked, leaning forward slightly in her chair. "You know you can tell me anything. Haven't we moved beyond the barriers that society would place between us?" Her words revealed just how completely she had internalized the narrative he had been building, the story of two souls finding connection despite the artificial divisions of race and status. She believed, truly believed, that what existed between them was something genuine and unprecedented, a relationship that transcended the normal rules of the world they inhabited. Samuel moved closer, close enough that he could see her face clearly in the lantern light, close enough to watch every subtle shift in her expression. "I think I'm falling in love with you," he said, and as the words left his mouth, he watched something break open in Abigail's face, watched decades of loneliness and longing finally find what seemed like an answer. In that moment, he sealed the trap he had been constructing for over a year. Abigail's response was immediate and devastating in its completeness. Tears began streaming down her face, and she reached for his hand with a desperation that would have moved anyone who didn't understand that this was exactly the response he had engineered. "Samuel," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I thought I was alone in these feelings. I thought I was going mad, imagining something that couldn't possibly be real." What followed was a confession from Abigail that revealed depths of loneliness that even Samuel, with all his careful psychological profiling, had not fully grasped. She spoke about the years of isolation, the social gatherings where she had been tolerated but never welcomed, the men who had considered courting her for her property but ultimately couldn't overcome their disgust at her appearance. She described the desperate hope she had felt when Samuel first began really talking to her, really listening to her ideas, really seeing her as a person rather than an unfortunate physical presence. "I know it's impossible," she said, still gripping his hand as though afraid he might disappear if she let go. "I know that society would never accept it, that we would be destroyed if anyone knew the truth. But Samuel, for the first time in my life, I don't care what society thinks. I don't care about anything except the fact that someone finally sees me as worthy of love." What Abigail couldn't know, what she had no way of understanding, was that every word Samuel had spoken was a lie, so carefully constructed that it contained elements of truth. He didn't love her, had never loved her, would never love her, but he had studied love with the dedication of a scholar, understanding its language, its gestures, its rhythms well enough to replicate them perfectly. His performance was flawless, because his survival had always depended on his ability to become whatever white people needed him to be. And what Abigail needed was someone to love her, so that's exactly what he became. But even as Samuel executed this crucial phase of his plan, something was stirring in the background that neither of them could yet see. Something that would transform this calculated act of revenge into a tragedy far more complex than Samuel had ever intended. The question that hung in the humid August air, unspoken and unrecognized, was not whether Samuel could maintain his deception, but what would happen when the full truth finally emerged, not just about Samuel's manipulation, but about the deeper currents of violence and trauma that had brought them both to this moment. From 1848 to 1854, Samuel's influence over Magnolia Ridge grew systematically and deliberately. The transformation was gradual enough that no single change seemed particularly alarming, but the cumulative effect was nothing short of revolutionary for a plantation in the antebellum South. Abigail, convinced that she had found a partner who understood her, who valued her intelligence and respected her humanity, increasingly relied on Samuel's counsel in all aspects of plantation management. He convinced her to make further improvements in the living conditions of enslaved workers, arguing that healthier, better-fed labourers would be more productive. This was true, but it wasn't his real motivation. By improving conditions in the quarters, he was building loyalty among the other enslaved people, creating a base of support that would prove crucial to his ultimate plans. He suggested changes in crop rotation that actually did improve yields, demonstrating to Abigail that his advice was valuable and worth following. He helped her navigate negotiations with cotton factors and merchants, displaying a keen understanding of business that most people would never expect from someone who had been enslaved. Most importantly, he systematically isolated Abigail from the few social connections she had maintained. He suggested that the neighbouring plantation owners who criticised her management style were motivated by jealousy and prejudice rather than genuine concern. He encouraged her to see herself as morally superior to her peers, a visionary who was building a new kind of plantation based on mutual respect rather than brutal coercion. And gradually, Abigail withdrew from social gatherings, from church attendance, from any interaction with white society, beyond the minimum necessary for business transactions. "I don't need them," she wrote in her journal in 1850, "when I have Samuel. He understands me in ways they never could. Together we're creating something better than what my father built, something that proves it's possible to be prosperous without being cruel." This entry, like so many others from this period, reveals a woman who had constructed an elaborate fantasy about the nature of her relationship with Samuel, a fantasy that he carefully maintained while pursuing his own very different agenda. The physical relationship between them, which began sometime in 1849, based on veiled references in Abigail's journals, further complicated the power dynamics at Magnolia Ridge. In the antebellum South, sexual relationships between white women and enslaved men were considered the ultimate transgression, violations of racial and sexual boundaries that could result in death for the enslaved man and complete social destruction for the woman. But within the isolation of Magnolia Ridge, where Abigail had effectively severed most ties with white society, this relationship existed in a strange bubble, protected by secrecy and Abigail's absolute authority over her property. For Samuel, this intimacy was another tool, another way to deepen Abigail's dependence on him, while also gathering information about her psychological vulnerabilities that would prove crucial later. Every moment of apparent tenderness, every gesture of affection was calculated and controlled. He had become what psychologists would later call a perfect manipulator, someone who could manufacture emotional connection without actually experiencing any genuine feeling himself. By 1852, Samuel had achieved something remarkable, effective control over Magnolia Ridge despite having no legal authority whatsoever. Abigail made no significant decisions without consulting him. The other enslaved workers understood that Samuel spoke with her authority, and that disobeying him was equivalent to disobeying the mistress herself. He had even managed to gain control over the plantation's financial records, ostensibly to help Abigail with bookkeeping, but actually to understand exactly where the Thornwood wealth came from and where it was vulnerable to disruption. But he had also made Abigail completely dependent on him emotionally and psychologically. She no longer trusted her own judgment without his confirmation. She had isolated herself so thoroughly from other white people that Samuel had become her only source of emotional support, intellectual stimulation, and physical intimacy. The woman who had inherited a substantial plantation in 1845 had, by 1852, essentially ceded control of it to an enslaved man who had spent 5 years systematically engineering her complete dependence on him. The other enslaved people at Magnolia Ridge had watched this transformation with mixed feelings. On one hand, Samuel's influence had genuinely improved their material conditions. They were better fed, better housed, and subjected to less physical violence than enslaved people on neighbouring plantations. But there was also something unsettling about Samuel's methods, a coldness in his interactions with Abigail when he thought no one else was watching, that suggested his motives were not entirely benevolent. Aunt Celia, who had observed the relationship from the beginning, later testified about a conversation she had with Samuel in the spring of 1853. "I asked him straight out," she recalled, "What are you doing with Miss Abigail? What's your game here?" And he looked at me with eyes that were just empty, like looking into a well with no water in it. And he said, "I'm giving her exactly what she deserves, Aunt Celia. Nothing more, nothing less." It was the way he said deserves that made my blood run cold. The beginning of the end came on a cold February morning in 1854, 6 years and 5 months after Samuel's calculated confession of love on the veranda. What Abigail discovered that morning would shatter every foundation of the relationship she thought she had built, would transform her understanding of the previous 6 years, and would ultimately destroy both her and Samuel in ways that neither had anticipated. The discovery was accidental, which made it even more devastating. Abigail had risen early, unable to sleep due to a persistent headache that had plagued her for days. She descended to the kitchen to prepare herself some willow bark tea, something she normally would have asked Samuel to do, but didn't want to wake him at such an early hour. As she moved through the quiet house, she noticed that the door to Samuel's room, normally closed, stood slightly ajar. She shouldn't have looked inside. Later, in the journals she filled during her final terrible years, she would write that some part of her knew, even in that moment, that whatever she saw through that door would change everything. But she looked anyway, drawn by a curiosity she couldn't name, and would later curse herself for indulging. Samuel's room was empty, the bed made with his characteristic precision. But on the small writing desk near the window, illuminated by the pale pre-dawn light, sat a wooden box that Abigail had never seen before. The box was open, and from where she stood in the doorway, she could see papers inside, letters or documents of some kind. For several long minutes, she stood frozen, torn between the impulse to respect Samuel's privacy and a growing sense that something was terribly wrong. When she finally crossed the threshold and approached the desk, when she lifted the first letter from the box and began to read, the world as she understood it began to collapse. The letter was dated July 1847, weeks before Samuel had arrived at Magnolia Ridge, and it was addressed to someone named Marcus at a plantation in South Carolina. The handwriting was Samuel's, the educated script that had once charmed her now seeming to mock her from the page. "The sale has been arranged," the letter began, "and I will arrive at the Thornwood plantation by month's end. Everything we discussed is in motion. The woman Abigail is exactly as your sources described. Isolated, desperate for connection, psychologically vulnerable from years of social rejection and an abusive father. She will be easy to manipulate, easier than the targets we've worked with before. I've studied her patterns from the reports you sent, and I've already planned my approach." Abigail's hands began to shake as she read, but she couldn't stop. The letter continued with clinical precision, outlining a strategy for gaining Abigail's trust, for making her dependent on him emotionally, for positioning himself to gain control over both her and the plantation. It discussed her physical appearance with cruel detachment, noting how her insecurity about her looks could be exploited to make her grateful for any attention. It analysed her intellectual interests and her conflicted feelings about slavery, identifying these as weaknesses that could be used against her. But it was the final paragraph that made Abigail's legs give out, that sent her collapsing into Samuel's chair, with the letter still clutched in her trembling hands. My father was murdered at this plantation in 1838 by Nathaniel Thornwood, beaten to death in front of the other enslaved workers for breaking a piece of china. My mother was pregnant with me at the time, forced to watch the entire thing, then sold away immediately afterward to prevent her from spreading stories about the incident. I was born into slavery hundreds of miles from where my father died, and I've spent my entire life planning revenge against the Thornwood family. Making the daughter fall in love with me, making her trust me completely, and then destroying her at the moment when she's most vulnerable, when losing me would hurt her most deeply. That will be justice for what her father did to my family. The wooden box contained dozens more letters, a comprehensive record of Samuel's 6-year manipulation of Abigail. Letters to and from abolitionists who had helped plan and fund his mission. Detailed psychological assessments, noting how Abigail's dependency on him was progressing. Strategic discussions about how to isolate her further from white society while consolidating his control over plantation operations. And worst of all, passages that revealed the depth of his hatred with chilling clarity. "Every smile I give her," he had written in a letter dated March 1850, "every gentle word, every gesture of affection is a lie designed to make her love me more, to make her more dependent on me, to set her up for the moment when I'll destroy everything she has, just as her father destroyed everything my family had. She thinks I love her. She has no idea that I despise her more than I've ever despised anyone. She represents everything that's wrong with this evil system, the casual cruelty, the self-deception that allows people to own other human beings while telling themselves they're being kind about it." Abigail sat in Samuel's chair as the sun rose over Magnolia Ridge, reading letter after letter, each one stripping away another layer of the reality she thought she had been living. Every conversation they'd had, every moment of apparent intimacy, every gesture that had made her feel valued and loved, all of it had been calculated and false. The only genuine relationship in her adult life, the only connection that had made her feel truly human, had been an elaborate deception orchestrated by someone who hated her with a depth and consistency that was almost incomprehensible. But then she found something else in the box. Something that would transform this already devastating revelation into something even more complex and terrible. Hidden beneath the letters was a small leather journal, Samuel's private diary, where he had recorded thoughts he shared with no one else. And in this diary, she discovered something that neither she nor Samuel had known when their relationship began, something that would make revenge impossible and redemption equally unattainable, something that would trap them both in a tragedy from which neither could escape. When Samuel returned to his room 3 hours later, he found Abigail sitting at his desk, surrounded by his letters, her face a mask of devastation that would have satisfied him completely if he had arrived even a day earlier. But what he saw in her hands made him freeze in the doorway, made his careful plans and years of calculated deception suddenly meaningless. She was holding his private diary, open to a specific page, and she was reading aloud in a voice that barely qualified as human. "Today I learned something that changes everything. Marcus sent me documents from the county records office, medical records from 1838 to 1844. I thought I knew what Nathaniel Thornwood was. I thought I understood the monster who killed my father. But I was wrong. He wasn't just a cruel master who beat enslaved people to death. He was something worse." Abigail stopped reading and looked up at Samuel, tears streaming down her face, but her eyes were not filled with the betrayed rage he had expected. Instead, they held something far more terrible, recognition and shared horror. "You found out about what he did to me," she whispered. "That's what's in these pages, isn't it? That's what you learned that made you write, 'I thought I knew what Nathaniel Thornwood was.'" Samuel stood frozen, unable to speak, unable to move, as Abigail continued reading from his diary. The medical records show repeated treatments for injuries consistent with systematic physical abuse, broken bones, deep bruises, burns. Dr. Wendell's father, the previous county physician, documented it all but could do nothing because Nathaniel Thornwood was too powerful. The abuse started when Abigail was 8 years old. The same year my father was murdered. It continued until she was 27, the year before she inherited the plantation. The year Nathaniel died in what was officially called a riding accident, but what the confidential medical examiner's notes suggest was something very different. She set down the diary and picked up another document, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. "You found the investigative report," she said, her voice breaking. "The one that was sealed by the county authorities. The one that concluded I had engineered my father's death, that I had sabotaged his saddle and selected a route I knew would take him past the steepest ravine on the property. That I had murdered him after 18 years of abuse that no one would stop because he was wealthy and respected, and I was just his ugly daughter that society pretended not to see." The confrontation that followed was nothing like what Samuel had planned for 6 years. There was no triumphant revelation of his deception, no moment where he could watch Abigail's world collapse under the weight of his betrayal. Instead, there was only a terrible recognition passing between them, a realization that they were both victims of the same monster, that Nathaniel Thornwood had destroyed 2 families in different ways, but with equal thoroughness. "Your father beat mine to death in front of your mother," Abigail said, still seated at Samuel's desk, surrounded by the evidence of his elaborate revenge plan. "My father beat me unconscious dozens of times over 18 years. Your father died quickly, mercifully almost, compared to what some people endure. I lived with mine for nearly 2 decades, trapped in a house where every day brought new terror, new pain, new humiliation." She picked up one of Samuel's letters, the one where he had described his plan to make her love him and then destroy her. "You wanted me to suffer the way your mother suffered when she watched your father die. You wanted me to experience loss and betrayal and pain. And you succeeded, Samuel. You succeeded completely, but not in the way you intended." The words hung in the air between them, and Samuel finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a hoarse whisper. "I didn't know. When I started this, when I made my plans, I thought you were just another plantation owner, another member of the family that destroyed mine. I thought you were complicit, comfortable, benefiting from a system you'd never questioned." "And I was," Abigail interrupted, her voice stronger now, cutting through his attempts at explanation. "I did benefit from it. I do own enslaved people. I am complicit in the same system that destroyed your family. The fact that I was also my father's victim doesn't erase that. We're both victims, and we're both perpetrators, Samuel. That's the terrible truth that makes your revenge plan impossible to complete, and makes my innocence impossible to claim." What followed was hours of conversation. Not the intimate evenings they had shared before, but something rawer and more painful. They compared their traumas, tried to understand how one man's cruelty had created such far-reaching destruction. Samuel spoke about growing up knowing his father had been murdered, about the determination for revenge that had shaped his entire life, about the years of planning and preparation that had gone into infiltrating Magnolia Ridge. Abigail spoke about her childhood, about learning to hide injuries, about the casual way her father would break her fingers as punishment for minor infractions, and then force her to sit through dinner pretending nothing had happened. "He used to tell me," Abigail continued, her voice steady now with the deadened calm of someone recounting horrors they've lived with so long they've become almost routine, "that I was lucky to have been born into wealth. That ugly women like me would starve on the streets without family money to make people tolerate our presence. He said that every beating was a lesson in gratitude, that I should thank him for caring enough to try to improve my character, even though my face and body were beyond redemption." Samuel listened, and for the first time in 6 years, his carefully maintained emotional distance began to crack. "My mother told me," he said slowly, "that my father's last words, as he lay dying from your father's beating, were 'Tell my son I'm sorry.' She never knew what he was apologizing for. Sorry for dying. Sorry for breaking the china. Sorry for bringing a child into a world where this could happen. But I always thought I understood. He was sorry that I would grow up without him, that I would have to become what slavery required me to become to survive." The terrible intimacy of this moment, this sharing of trauma between two people who had been locked in an elaborate psychological war, created something that neither had anticipated. It didn't erase Samuel's 6 years of deception or make Abigail's complicity in slavery disappear, but it complicated everything, made simple revenge impossible and simple forgiveness equally unattainable. "So what happens now?" Abigail asked finally, as the afternoon light began to fade and the reality of their situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. "You've spent 6 years planning to destroy me. You've made me love you, made me dependent on you, isolated me from everyone else in the world. And now we've discovered that we're both victims of the same man, both damaged by the same systematic cruelty. What do you do with a revenge plan that no longer makes sense?" Samuel's response revealed the full extent of the trap they had both created. "I don't know. I can't love you because of what you represent, because you're still a slave owner even if you're also a victim. You can't love me because everything you thought you knew about me was a lie, because every tender moment we shared was me manipulating you. We're both trapped in something that your father created when he murdered my father and tortured you. We're both victims who became perpetrators, and there's no escape from that." But the revelation was not complete. As the two of them sat in Samuel's room, surrounded by the evidence of his deception and the truth about their shared victimization, Abigail remembered something else from the diary, something she hadn't read aloud. She picked it up again, found the page, and her face went pale. "There's more, isn't there?" she said, her voice barely audible. "Something you learned that you haven't told me yet, something in these later entries from the past year." Samuel's silence was answer enough. Abigail read from the diary, her voice shaking. "I'm losing control of the plan. Something I didn't anticipate is happening. Somewhere in all the lies I've told her, somewhere in all the fake tenderness and manufactured affection, I've started to actually care about her. Not love. I don't think I'm capable of loving someone who represents everything my family suffered under. But something. Some recognition that she's human, that she's suffering, that her pain is as real as mine even though it comes from different sources." She looked up at Samuel, and in her eyes was a terrible understanding. "You wrote this 6 months ago. You've been struggling with this for half a year, trying to maintain your hatred while recognizing my humanity. That's why you haven't completed your revenge yet, isn't it? That's why you're still here, still playing this role, when you could have destroyed me months ago." What Samuel said next would define everything that followed, would set them both on a path toward mutual destruction that neither could prevent. "Yes, I've hated myself for it, told myself I was betraying my father's memory, that I was weak and pathetic for feeling anything but contempt for you. But I couldn't help it, Abigail. When you told me about your father's abuse, when I saw how you flinched at sudden movements, when I watched you struggle with the same nightmares that plague me, I started to see you as a person instead of just a symbol. And that made everything impossible. What happened at Magnolia Ridge between February 1854 and April 1856 represents one of the most psychologically complex periods of mutual destruction ever documented in American history. The two people who had been locked in an elaborate game of manipulation and counter-manipulation found themselves unable to separate, unable to move forward, unable to forgive, and unable to complete the revenge that had started everything. They continued to live in the same house, continued to manage the plantation together, but the nature of their relationship had transformed into something toxic and consuming. Samuel had freed himself legally. Abigail had signed manumission papers in a gesture that neither of them could interpret as entirely genuine or entirely manipulative. But he chose to remain at Magnolia Ridge, bound to Abigail not by law, but by a twisted emotional connection that both of them recognized as destructive, but neither could escape. The other enslaved workers at Magnolia Ridge watched this slow-motion catastrophe with growing concern. Several of them, including Aunt Celia, attempted to intervene, to convince Samuel to leave, to help Abigail understand that she needed to separate herself from a relationship that was destroying her. But their efforts went nowhere, rebuffed by two people who seemed determined to consume each other completely. Their conversations during this period, witnessed by house servants and later documented in testimony, were described as deeply disturbing. They would spend hours discussing Nathaniel Thornwood's cruelty, comparing their respective traumas, trying to understand how one man's evil had created such far-reaching destruction. They would argue about responsibility and guilt, about whether Abigail was culpable for benefiting from slavery, even though she had not chosen to be born into that system, about whether Samuel's revenge would have been justified if he had completed it. "You can't forgive me," Samuel said during one of these conversations. His voice hollow with exhaustion and something darker. "Because forgiving me would mean accepting that you spent 6 years loving someone who was pretending, that the only relationship that ever made you feel valued was built on lies from the beginning. And I can't forgive you because you're still a slave owner, still complicit in the system that destroyed my family, no matter how much your father hurt you too." Abigail's response revealed the impossible bind they were both trapped in. "And you can't leave because some part of you has started to care about me despite everything, which makes you feel like you're betraying your father's memory. While I can't stop loving you even though I know I shouldn't, even though I know every tender moment we shared was manipulation. We're destroying each other, Samuel, and we can't seem to stop." The physical toll of this psychological warfare became visible within months. Abigail began to lose weight rapidly, dropping from 280 pounds to barely 200 by the summer of 1854. She stopped eating regularly, stopped maintaining her appearance, stopped engaging with the few social obligations that remained to her. Her journals from this period are filled with self-recrimination and desperate attempts to understand how her life had arrived at this point. By the fall of 1855, the deterioration had accelerated dramatically. Abigail rarely left her bedroom, sustained herself primarily on laudanum and weak tea, and spent most of her time writing in journals that became increasingly incoherent as her physical and mental health collapsed. She had wasted to barely 120 pounds, her body consuming itself as her mind consumed itself with questions that had no answers. Samuel, meanwhile, experienced his own form of psychological destruction. The hatred that had sustained him through years of slavery, through the careful planning and execution of his revenge, had been complicated by unwanted empathy and recognition of shared victimhood. He couldn't complete his revenge because he had come to see Abigail as human, but he couldn't move beyond the revenge either, because that would require forgiving the system that had destroyed his family. He was trapped between two impossible positions, unable to go forward or back. The house servants reported that he would sit for hours in a chair near Abigail's bedroom, not speaking, not moving, just staring at nothing with an expression that one witness described as like looking into a well with no water in it, just emptiness all the way down. The vibrant intelligence that had made him such an effective manipulator had turned inward, consuming him from the inside. But even in their mutual destruction, they couldn't separate. Some invisible force, some combination of trauma bonding and shared recognition and twisted emotional dependency, kept them locked together. They were like two people drowning who clutch at each other, not to save themselves, but because the shared drowning is somehow less terrible than drowning alone. By early 1856, it had become clear to everyone at Magnolia Ridge that Abigail was dying, not from any specific illness, but from a complete failure of the will to live, from a psychological and spiritual collapse so profound that her body simply gave up. And Samuel, watching this happen, found himself unable to leave, unable to save her, unable to do anything except witness the destruction that his revenge and their shared trauma had created. Dr. Marcus Wendell would never forget the scene he discovered when he arrived at Magnolia Ridge on that warm April morning in 1856. A servant had ridden to his office in town before dawn, bringing news that Miss Thornwood was near death and requesting his immediate attendance. But nothing in his medical training or his years of practice had prepared him for what he found. Abigail lay in her bed, barely recognizable as the woman he had last seen 18 months earlier. Her body had wasted to what he later estimated at less than 90 pounds. Her skin stretched tight over bones that seemed too prominent, too sharp. Empty laudanum bottles covered the bedside table, and the room smelled of sickness and decay. But what truly horrified Dr. Wendell was her eyes, still conscious, still aware, watching him with an expression of such profound suffering that he would see it in his nightmares for the rest of his life. Samuel sat in a chair in the corner of the room, and the doctor's first thought was that he was looking at a corpse that hadn't yet realized it was dead. The young man who had arrived at Magnolia Ridge 9 years earlier, full of intelligence and careful calculation, had been replaced by something hollow and broken. His eyes, which witnesses had described as penetrating and alive, were now completely empty, staring at nothing with the blank gaze of someone who had looked too long into an abyss and found himself unable to look away. "Doctor," Abigail whispered, her voice barely audible, "you need to read the journals. All of them. In the desk drawer. You need to understand what happened here." She paused, struggling for breath, each word clearly costing her enormous effort. "Not for me. Not for Samuel. But so someone knows the truth. So someone understands how this evil system destroys everyone it touches, even the people who think they're victims, even the people who think they're seeking justice." Dr. Wendell approached the bed, his medical instincts taking over despite his shock. He checked her pulse, thin and irregular, and examined her wasted frame with growing horror. "Miss Thornwood," he said gently, "you need to eat. You need proper medicine. This laudanum dependency is killing you faster than whatever psychological troubles you're experiencing." Abigail's laugh was dry and terrible, more like a cough than genuine mirth. "I'm not trying to live, Doctor, I'm trying to die. But even that, it seems, requires more strength than I have left." She turned her head slightly, looking towards Samuel, who hadn't moved or acknowledged Dr. Wendell's presence. "Tell him, Samuel. Tell the doctor what we learned. Tell him how we destroyed each other while trying to understand who was the victim and who was the perpetrator." For the first time, Samuel's eyes focused, fixing on Dr. Wendell with an intensity that made the physician step back involuntarily. "We found out," Samuel said, his voice rough from disuse, "that trauma is not a competition. That my suffering didn't erase hers, and her suffering didn't justify my actions. We found out that revenge is not justice, that destroying someone who's already been destroyed doesn't balance anything. It just creates more destruction. We found out too late that we were both casualties of a war neither of us declared, fighting each other when we should have been fighting the system that created us both." Over the next several hours, as Abigail drifted in and out of consciousness, Dr. Wendell read through the journals she had directed him to. 17 leather-bound volumes that documented everything. Samuel's arrival and calculated seduction, the 6 years of manipulation and growing emotional dependency, the discovery of his deception, the revelation about Nathaniel Thornwood's abuse of both Abigail and Samuel's father, and finally, the 2 terrible years of mutual destruction that had brought them to this point. The journals also contained something else. Something that Dr. Wendell found even more disturbing than the personal tragedy they documented. They contained evidence that Samuel's infiltration of Magnolia Ridge had been part of a larger network, that abolitionist organizations had specifically targeted psychologically vulnerable plantation owners, had placed educated enslaved people in positions where they could gain control and create scandals that would damage the institution's reputation. There were letters from coordinators, strategic discussions about which plantations to target, assessments of which owners showed weaknesses that could be exploited. Samuel had been one piece in a much larger operation, and Abigail had been selected not because of anything she personally had done, but because she represented an easy target, someone whose isolation and psychological damage made her perfect for manipulation. What happened next would haunt Dr. Wendell for the rest of his life. As he sat with the journals spread around him, trying to process the scope of what had transpired at Magnolia Ridge, Abigail suddenly spoke with a clarity and strength that seemed impossible given her physical condition. "Samuel," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife, "I need to tell you something before I die, something I only realized in these final weeks." She struggled to sit up slightly, and Dr. Wendell moved to help her, but she waved him away. "Your father, the day he died. I was there. I was 10 years old, hiding in the pantry because my father had beaten me that morning, and I was afraid he'd do it again if he saw me. I watched the whole thing." Samuel, who had barely moved in hours, suddenly turned to look at her, his empty eyes showing the first spark of real emotion Dr. Wendell had seen. "What are you saying?" "Your father didn't just accidentally break a piece of china," Abigail continued, each word clearly costing her enormous effort. "He saw my father beating me. He intervened, tried to stop it, told my father that hurting a child was wrong. That's why my father killed him, Samuel, not because of broken china, because your father tried to protect me." The silence that followed this revelation was absolute and suffocating. Dr. Wendell watched as Samuel's face went through a series of transformations, shock giving way to understanding, giving way to a grief so profound it seemed to physically crush him. "My whole life," Samuel whispered, "I thought my father died for nothing, for a stupid accident with a piece of dishware. But he died trying to save you. He died doing something noble, something human, trying to protect a child from violence. And I've spent 9 years destroying the child he died trying to save." Abigail's tears flowed freely now, the first tears Dr. Wendell had seen since he arrived. "Don't you see, Samuel? We've both been destroying the wrong people. You should have been angry at the system, at men like my father who used their power to hurt the powerless. Not at me, and I should have worked to dismantle the institution that gave men like my father the power to destroy so many lives. Not just tried to be slightly less cruel while still participating in it. We were both fighting the wrong war." "But it's too late now," Samuel said, his voice breaking completely. "You're dying, and I killed you just as surely as if I'd beaten you to death like your father beat mine. The method was different, but the result is the same. I destroyed someone my father died trying to protect." Abigail shook her head weakly. "We destroyed each other, Samuel. That's the truth. You manipulated me, but I chose to believe you, because I was so desperate to be loved that I ignored warning signs. You planned revenge, but I perpetuated a system that made revenge seem necessary. We're both responsible for where we ended up." Dr. Wendell, witnessing this exchange, later wrote in his private journals that he felt like he was watching two people drowning, not in water, but in the accumulated weight of historical evil and personal trauma that neither of them had created, but both had perpetuated. "There was no villain in that room," he wrote, "only victims of a system so fundamentally corrupt that it poisoned everything it touched, creating cycles of pain and revenge that had no clear beginning and no possible end." Abigail Thornwood died 3 days after Dr. Wendell's arrival, on April 6, 1856. Her death was officially recorded as resulting from natural causes, a polite fiction that protected both her reputation and Samuel from potential legal consequences that neither of them cared about anymore. She had left her entire estate to Samuel in a will written during those final terrible years, a gesture that he later described to Dr. Wendell as not forgiveness, but acknowledgement. An acknowledgement that we were both casualties of the same war, and that property and wealth meant nothing in the face of what we had done to each other. In her final hours, barely conscious, Abigail had whispered something that only Samuel heard, something he would later share with Dr. Wendell. "I forgive you for the lies, and I forgive my father for what he did to me. Not because either of you deserves forgiveness, but because holding on to this hatred is what's been killing me all along. The revenge, the anger, the need for justice, it's all just another form of being controlled by the people who hurt us." Samuel remained at Magnolia Ridge for exactly 1 week after Abigail's death. During that time, he arranged for the other formerly enslaved people who had lived on the plantation to receive portions of the estate, setting up trusts and purchasing land in the north, where those who wanted to leave could resettle. He sold the plantation itself to investors from Savannah, refusing to keep any of the money for himself beyond what he needed for basic survival. Then, on April 13, 1856, he left a letter for Dr. Wendell and disappeared. The letter would become one of the most remarkable documents in American history, once it was finally unsealed and examined by historians over a century later. "Dr. Wendell," the letter began in Samuel's educated script, "by the time you read this, I will have left Georgia permanently, gone to a place where neither the Thornwood name nor my own history can follow me. But before I go, I need you to understand something that I have only come to understand in these final days with Abigail, as I watched her die from wounds I helped to inflict. Revenge is not justice. When I set out to destroy Abigail psychologically, when I made her love me only to reveal that everything was a lie, I thought I was balancing the scales for what her father had done to my family. I had convinced myself that her suffering would somehow redeem my father's death, would honor my mother's pain, would make the universe a little more fair. But I was wrong about everything. What I actually did was add more suffering to a world that already had far too much of it. I took a woman who had already been victimized by the same man who killed my father, who had already experienced years of abuse and trauma, and I victimized her again. I used her loneliness, her desperate need for connection, her psychological vulnerabilities, and I exploited all of it to make her suffer. And in doing so, I became the same thing I hated. I became another person using power over the powerless to inflict pain. The letter continued for several pages, describing Samuel's growing recognition during his years with Abigail that trauma is not a competition, that suffering doesn't cancel out other suffering, that revenge creates new cycles of pain rather than ending old ones. He wrote about the moment he discovered Nathaniel Thornwood's abuse of Abigail, about how it had complicated his simple narrative of victim and oppressor, about how impossible it had become to complete his revenge once he recognized her humanity. "But here is what haunts me most," the letter concluded, "and what I need you to understand if you ever tell this story. I failed at revenge, but I also failed at empathy. When I learned what Nathaniel Thornwood had done to Abigail, when I understood that she was as much his victim as my father was, I should have stopped my manipulation immediately. I should have told her the truth, offered her genuine support, found some way to heal together from our shared trauma. But I didn't. I couldn't let go of my hatred even when I knew it no longer made sense, couldn't abandon my plans even when I recognized they were wrong. And that failure, that inability to choose compassion over revenge even when I knew better, that's what actually destroyed us both. Abigail told me in her final hours that she forgave me, that she forgave her father, that the only way to break cycles of violence is to refuse to perpetuate them even when we have good reasons for anger. I don't know if I can forgive anyone, including myself. But I do know this. If you tell this story, Doctor, tell it as a warning. Tell it so that other people who are contemplating revenge, who are planning to hurt those who have hurt them, might understand what I learned too late. Revenge doesn't heal trauma. It doesn't honor the dead. It doesn't make the universe more just. All it does is create more casualties, more suffering, more brokenness. My father died trying to protect a child from violence. I spent 9 years destroying that child, telling myself I was honoring his memory. But the truth is that if my father could see what I did to Abigail, he would be ashamed of me. The man who died trying to stop violence would not want his son to spend his life inflicting it, no matter how justified it seemed. Dr. Wendell, after reading Samuel's letter and reviewing all the journals and documents from Magnolia Ridge, made a decision that would ensure the story remained hidden for over a century. He sealed everything, all the journals, all the letters, all the evidence of what had transpired, in a metal box that he deposited with a lawyer in Savannah, with instructions that it should not be opened until at least 50 years after his own death. His reasoning, explained in his own letter that accompanied the sealed documents, reveals his understanding of how complex truth can be weaponized in times of political conflict. The truth about Magnolia Ridge is too complex and too painful to serve any constructive purpose in our current moment. Pro-slavery advocates would use it to argue that abolitionists are manipulative and cruel. Abolitionists would use it to demonstrate the psychological damage slavery inflicts. Neither side would see what I see, that this tragedy transcends political arguments and reveals something deeper about human nature and the long-term effects of systematic cruelty. Let time and distance provide the perspective necessary to understand this story without allowing it to become ammunition in the great debate that is tearing our nation apart. Perhaps in a future when slavery has ended, when the passions of our time have cooled, someone will be able to look at what happened between Abigail Thornwood and Samuel and understand it not as a political lesson, but as a human tragedy that deserves to be remembered in all its terrible complexity. The documents remained sealed until 1923, when Dr. Wendell's great-grandson, a professor of history at the University of Georgia, gained access to them and began the process of documenting what had actually occurred. His research uncovered additional layers that complicated the story even further, details that neither Abigail nor Samuel nor even Dr. Wendell had fully understood. Through interviews with descendants of the people who had been enslaved at Magnolia Ridge, the professor discovered that many of them had been aware of aspects of Samuel's plan that none of the main participants had known they knew. Aunt Celia, who had died in 1889 at the age of 93, had left a narrative of her experiences that her granddaughter had carefully preserved. "We saw what was happening," Aunt Celia's narrative explained, "but we didn't know what to do about it. Samuel was playing a dangerous game with Miss Abigail, and we could see it was going to end badly for both of them. Some of us tried to warn him, tried to tell him that revenge like this never works out the way you plan. But he was determined, and Miss Abigail was too lonely and too damaged to see what was really happening until it was too late. What haunted us most was knowing that both of them were victims, both of them were suffering, but they were so focused on their own pain that they couldn't see each other clearly until it was too late to matter. Mr. Nathaniel, he destroyed so many people, not just the ones he killed or beat, but the ones he damaged so badly they went on to hurt other people. That's the real evil of what he did. It didn't stop with him. It kept spreading like poison in water. The professor's research also uncovered evidence that fundamentally changed the understanding of Nathaniel Thornwood's death in 1845. Hidden among county records that had been misfiled and forgotten for decades, he found the original confidential report from the medical examiner, a document that revealed something shocking. Nathaniel Thornwood's riding accident had not been engineered by Abigail alone. The report, based on interviews conducted immediately after Nathaniel's death, but sealed to protect the family's reputation, indicated that at least 3 enslaved people from Magnolia Ridge had been involved in sabotaging the saddle and selecting the route. They had worked with Abigail, coordinating the plan, executing it together because they all had their own reasons for wanting Nathaniel dead. One of them was the brother of Samuel's father, a man who had watched his sibling beaten to death 7 years earlier and had been waiting for the right opportunity for revenge. This revelation transformed the narrative once again. Abigail's patricide had not been the isolated act of a desperate daughter, but part of a coordinated effort involving multiple people who had all suffered under Nathaniel's cruelty. And Samuel, arriving at Magnolia Ridge 9 years later to avenge his father's death, had been unknowingly targeting someone who had already helped kill his father's murderer. The revenge he sought had already been achieved. He just didn't know it. The professor documented this in his research notes with a comment that revealed his own struggle to process the layers of irony and tragedy. If Samuel had known that Abigail participated in killing Nathaniel Thornwood, that she had worked with his uncle to avenge his father's murder, would it have changed anything? Would he have seen her as an ally rather than an enemy? Or would he have been even more angry that she had robbed him of the revenge he'd spent his life planning? The questions multiply endlessly, and none of them have satisfying answers. Modern psychologists who have studied the Magnolia Ridge case have identified it as one of the most complex examples of trauma bonding and mutual psychological destruction in American history. Dr. Helena Morrison, a specialist in historical trauma at Columbia University, published a comprehensive analysis of the case in 1987 that has become the definitive psychological interpretation of what occurred between Abigail and Samuel. What we see at Magnolia Ridge, Dr. Morrison wrote, is not simply a story of revenge gone wrong, but a demonstration of how systematic oppression creates cascading cycles of trauma that can persist across generations. Nathaniel Thornwood's cruelty didn't just damage the people he directly victimized. It created psychological wounds that those victims then inflicted on each other, perpetuating the harm long after the original perpetrator was dead. Both Abigail and Samuel exhibited what we would now recognize as complex post-traumatic stress disorder, personality fragmentation resulting from sustained abuse, and the tendency of trauma survivors to reenact their traumas in their adult relationships. Abigail's relationship with Samuel can be understood as an unconscious attempt to recreate and master her relationship with her father. She had been powerless as a child to stop Nathaniel's abuse, but as an adult with complete legal authority over Samuel, she believed she could create a different outcome, a relationship based on mutual respect rather than domination. What she failed to recognize was that the fundamental power imbalance inherent in slavery made such a relationship impossible. No matter how kindly she treated Samuel, she still claimed ownership over him, still benefited from the system that had destroyed his family. The relationship was poisoned from the beginning by structural inequalities that individual goodwill could never overcome. Dr. Morrison's analysis of Samuel's psychology is equally insightful. Samuel's manipulation of Abigail represented his attempt to reclaim power in a world that had systematically stripped him of it. By making her dependent on him emotionally, while he remained emotionally detached, He reversed the traditional power dynamic of slavery. He became the one with control, the one who could hurt or help as he chose, the one whose approval mattered. But this reversal of power didn't heal his trauma. It only created new trauma for both of them, while leaving the original wound unaddressed. The fact that Samuel ultimately couldn't complete his revenge, that he developed unwanted empathy for Abigail despite his intentions, reveals something important about human psychology. Intimate contact with another person, even when that contact begins as manipulation, creates genuine emotional bonds that are difficult to deny or destroy. Samuel had spent years studying Abigail, understanding her fears and hopes, listening to her thoughts and dreams. In the process, he had made her real to him as a person, rather than just a symbol of everything he hated. This recognition of Abigail's humanity, which Samuel experienced as a failure of his will and a betrayal of his family's memory, was actually evidence that he had not been completely destroyed by the system that had oppressed him. The part of him that could feel empathy, that could recognize shared suffering, was fighting against the part that had been damaged by trauma and driven by hatred. His inability to complete his revenge was not weakness, but evidence of psychological health struggling to assert itself. The story of Magnolia Ridge has become, in the decades since its unsealing, a crucial case study for understanding the psychological and social dynamics of slavery in the antebellum South. It demonstrates several important truths that have broader implications for how we understand historical oppression and its long-term effects. First, it reveals that slavery was not just an economic system or a political arrangement, but a psychological catastrophe that damaged everyone it touched, enslaved and enslaver alike. Nathaniel Thornwood's capacity for violence against enslaved people was inseparable from his violence against his own daughter. The dehumanization required to maintain slavery as an institution inevitably spread beyond racial boundaries, corrupting all human relationships and making genuine connection nearly impossible. Second, the case demonstrates the limitations of individual moral action within systematically unjust systems. Abigail's attempts to be a kinder slave owner, to treat the people she enslaved with more respect than her father had shown, ultimately changed nothing fundamental about their relationship. Individual kindness cannot redeem structural evil, and Abigail's story shows the danger of believing that being slightly less cruel, while still participating in an oppressive system, represents meaningful moral progress. Third, Magnolia Ridge illustrates how cycles of trauma and revenge perpetuate themselves across generations when they are not consciously interrupted. Samuel's quest for revenge against the Thornwood family was understandable, even justified in some sense, given what had been done to his father. But executing that revenge by victimizing someone who was herself a victim of the same man only created more suffering without addressing the root causes of the original harm. The question that Magnolia Ridge forces us to confront is this: how do we break cycles of violence and retaliation that have clear historical origins in systematic oppression? How do we pursue justice for historical wrongs without simply creating new victims? How do we acknowledge the reality of trauma and suffering without allowing it to justify inflicting trauma and suffering on others? These questions have no easy answers, and the tragedy of Abigail and Samuel demonstrates what happens when we try to resolve them through individual acts of revenge rather than collective efforts at systematic change. Both of them were trapped in roles that the institution of slavery had created, fighting each other when they should have been fighting the system that had damaged them both. Samuel's fate after leaving Georgia remained a mystery for many years, though evidence discovered in the 1960s suggests he may have settled in Philadelphia under an assumed name. A diary found among papers donated to the Philadelphia Historical Society contains entries that match details from Samuel's life and perspective, though the authorship has never been definitively confirmed. If this diary is genuine, it reveals that Samuel spent the last 30 years of his life working with freed people, helping them navigate the legal and social challenges of life in the North. The entries describe a man trying desperately to do good in the world, to help others avoid the mistakes he had made, to prevent other people from pursuing revenge that would ultimately destroy them. One entry, dated 1873, contains a passage that may represent Samuel's final reflection on Magnolia Ridge. "I have spent 17 years trying to help others find freedom and build new lives, trying to do some good that might balance the harm I caused. But I have never been able to forgive myself for what I did to Abigail Thornwood. Yes, she was complicit in the system that enslaved my people. Yes, she benefited from the plantation her father built on our suffering, but she was also a victim, and I made her suffer more than she already had. I told myself I was seeking justice, but justice would have been working to end slavery, not destroying one woman who was as much a prisoner of the system as I was. I won the battle against Abigail, but I lost something more important in the process: my own humanity. My father died trying to protect a child from violence. I spent 9 years destroying that same child, and no amount of good work can ever make that right. The property that had been Magnolia Ridge changed hands several times in the decades following Abigail's death. The main house, which had witnessed so much suffering and deception, burned down in 1873 under circumstances that were never fully explained. Local historians have speculated that it may have been deliberately set on fire by former slaves who wanted to erase the physical reminder of their oppression, though this has never been proven. The land itself was eventually subdivided and sold to small farmers, both white and black, during the Reconstruction era. By the early 20th century, there was little physical evidence that a major plantation had ever existed. The only reminder was a small cemetery where Abigail Thornwood was buried, her grave marked by a simple stone that gave only her name and dates: Abigail Thornwood, 1817 to 1856. No monument marks where Samuel might be buried, if indeed the Philadelphia Diary was his. But perhaps that's fitting for a man who spent the last part of his life trying to disappear, trying to escape a history that followed him no matter how far he travelled or how much good he tried to do. The story of Magnolia Ridge challenges us to think more deeply about justice, revenge, and the long-term effects of systematic oppression. It reveals that trauma creates complex psychological dynamics that cannot be easily resolved through simple narratives of good versus evil, victim versus perpetrator. Both Abigail Thornwood and Samuel were real people who made choices under impossible circumstances, who hurt each other while also being hurt by forces beyond their control. The case demonstrates that slavery was not just an injustice perpetrated by evil people against innocent victims, though it was certainly that. It was also a system so fundamentally corrupting that it damaged everyone it touched, creating cycles of violence and psychological destruction that persisted across generations. Nathaniel Thornwood's cruelty toward enslaved people and toward his own daughter were not separate phenomena, but expressions of the same dehumanizing worldview that slavery required and cultivated. Samuel's elaborate revenge against Abigail, while understandable given what her family had done to his, ultimately created more suffering without addressing the root cause of that suffering. His manipulation of a vulnerable woman, his exploitation of her loneliness and need for connection, his willingness to spend years lying to someone who believed she loved him, these actions were themselves forms of cruelty that added to the sum total of pain in the world, rather than reducing it. And yet, Samuel's inability to complete his revenge, his unwanted recognition of Abigail as a fellow victim, offers a glimmer of hope amidst the tragedy. It suggests that empathy and recognition of shared humanity can emerge even in the most corrupted circumstances, even between people separated by the most fundamental power imbalances. The fact that Samuel came to see Abigail as a person rather than just a symbol, even though this recognition came too late to save either of them, demonstrates something important about the resilience of human connection, even in systems designed to destroy it. The documents sealed by Dr. Wendell and eventually opened decades later serve as a reminder that history is always more complex than the simple stories we tell about it. The truth about Magnolia Ridge, with all its psychological complexity and moral ambiguity, challenges simplistic narratives about the antebellum South while also confirming the fundamental evil of slavery as an institution. What happened at Magnolia Ridge shows us that individual acts of kindness cannot redeem systematic injustice, that personal revenge cannot heal collective trauma, and that the damage caused by dehumanization persists long after the specific acts of cruelty have ended. It shows us that breaking cycles of violence requires more than simply reversing who has power over whom. It requires dismantling the systems that create and perpetuate those power imbalances in the first place. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Abigail and Samuel reminds us that victims of oppression can also become perpetrators, that trauma can be passed from one person to another like a contagion, and that the only way to truly heal is to consciously choose to interrupt these cycles rather than perpetuating them. Neither Abigail nor Samuel was able to make that choice until it was too late. Their tragedy serves as a warning about what happens when we let our pain and anger guide our actions, rather than consciously working toward justice and healing. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that Samuel's revenge was justified, even though he ultimately couldn't complete it? Or was his manipulation of Abigail as morally wrong as the system that had oppressed him? The evidence suggests that both Abigail and Samuel were casualties of Nathaniel Thornwood's cruelty and the broader institution of slavery, trapped in a tragic confrontation that neither had truly chosen, but both participated in creating. Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about how cycles of trauma and revenge can be broken, and what true justice might look like in the aftermath of systematic oppression. The questions raised by Magnolia Ridge remain relevant today as we continue to grapple with the long-term effects of historical injustices and the challenge of creating a more just society without simply reversing who holds power over whom. If you enjoyed this exploration of one of the most psychologically complex cases from antebellum Georgia, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates stories that challenge simple narratives about good and evil. Remember, understanding the full complexity of history, including its most uncomfortable truths, is essential to ensuring we don't repeat its worst mistakes. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another mystery from America's hidden past that reveals uncomfortable truths about the society that shaped our present, and the human cost of systems built on the systematic dehumanization of people who deserve dignity, freedom, and the right to live without fear.